Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Lewis Too Much Analyzes Comics. We'll be analyzing issues 22 through 24 of The Question by Denny O'Neil and Dennis Cowan. And we finally arrived at Election Day. If you've been following along with the past few videos, you know that Myra, Vic's somewhat love interest, has been running for mayor. She is trying to take over the city from her drunken husband, and she's been running against this very blatantly evil racist character who has ties to the KKK, and not only ties to the KKK, but we find out in this issue also ties to the Yakuza. So he's very obviously this almost a cartoonishly evil character, and so Myra is running against him. So let's go ahead and get into the issue. So the issue opens with Mayor Furman, Myra's husband, thinking about killing himself. We haven't really discussed very much Mayor Furman, but he's a very obvious alcoholic. That's an idea that gets repeated throughout the story, because Myra is she's a very empathetic character, and so she actually cares about Mayor Furman, even though she was conned into this she was blackmailed into this marriage with him. She cares about him and she wants to get him help, but because of the fact that he has this problem, he's constantly causing her problems, which actually is something that I have personal experience with. I used to work it was kind of like an outreach sort of nonprofit organization, and we helped homeless people, and one of the people that I used to help, I helped a number of people that were alcoholics, but I was thinking of one in specific that he was honestly a very genuinely good-natured guy. He had a good heart. You could call on him if you needed something, and he'd be there for you. But because of the fact that he was an alcoholic, he was constantly putting himself in bad situations that then, we would always have to come in and rescue him from. He was always borrowing money because he needed to, fuel his addiction, and so even though we had a lot of empathy for him because of the fact that we cared about him, and again, he was a very good-natured guy, he was constantly getting himself into trouble and then causing us problems. And so it's a frustrating situation because you genuinely care about this person, and you want to see them get out of that situation, but because of the fact that they have this addiction, that clings to them, it's very difficult to know even what to do for them. And essentially that's the situation here with Myra, is that she's caught up in this situation where she cares about this guy, and again, and this guy's not even very good-natured, so it's a testament to Myra's compassion that she would care about this guy. But Mayor Furman is constantly putting her in bad situations, and we'll see one specific moment that I've been there myself, but we'll get to that when we get to that. So anyway, so he's trying to kill himself. Myra comes in. She actually takes the gun away from him, and tells him and pretty much catches him up on everything that's been going on. Because of the fact that he's been drunk for the last year, he doesn't even remember the fact that she's the one that's running for mayor and not him that's running for mayor. And so she takes the gun away from him, and we find out that, she's very conflicted internally in terms of her mayoral race. She knows that it would be good for the city if she wins, and she thinks that she can do good if she wins, but then at the same time she knows that it's a giant burden to accept this responsibility to, if she wins, because essentially she takes upon herself the responsibility of running the government in this very corrupt city that she actually wants to fix, right? Because if you're corrupt and you take part in a corrupt government, then there's, then you can kind of kick back and relax and enjoy the ride, right? But if you're entering into this situation where there's utter corruption and you actually want to get into that system and try and, fix the system from within, you know that you're taking upon yourself a heavy load. And so she understands that she's taking upon herself this heavy load, and she is a little she's nervous about it. And that's gonna kind of play into one of the ideas of the story, that the contrast between reluctant leadership and power-hungry leadership, because Dinsmore, the guy that she's running against, Sage later on is going to talk about how he's this power-hungry megalomaniac who just wants to control things for the sake of controlling things, because it feeds his ego, and it's actually the reason that he exists is to control other people, is to have power. And I, personally, I assume all of us have met people like this, have had people like that in our lives, people that are so consumed with power that it's the only thing that drives them, and they'll do anything that it takes to get that power, and they'll lie, they'll manipulate, and they'll pretend to themselves, typically these are narcissistic personalities, they'll pretend to themselves that they're not doing anything wrong, and that anybody that stands in their way, it's because that person is actually evil, and they themselves are noble and are just looking to do what's right and good and virtuous. And so if you're in their way, or even if you're just telling them like, hey man, like you're acting in this way that isn't right, they will treat you as if you're an enemy. And so essentially that's the idea that Denny is playing with here, is the idea that Myra is a reluctant hero, right? Or somebody who wants power reluctantly. And that's actually the noble person, right? The noble person is very humble about accepting power, recognizes how much sacrifice is required in order to wield power. That's the noble and responsible person, versus the person that wants power for the sake of power. They're obviously going to ultimately abuse the power, and they're ultimately going to use that power only to benefit themselves and not to benefit anybody else. The person that's reluctant, again, understands that there's all these people that are now relying on them, and because of the fact that they actually care about those people that are relying on them, they understand the weight of the situation. And so the reluctant, the person who wields power reluctantly is a better leader than the person who desires to wield that power. And obviously, when we look out into the world, into the political situation as that we're in right now, that's something to keep in mind. And if you've seen my past videos, I say that on both sides of the spectrum. I'm not partial to one side or the other. People that desire power for the sake of power are typically never people who should be trusted with power, at least according to Denny O'Neil and me. So anyways, after this scene, we're introduced to the whole subplot about the Yakuza. So Vic Sage is called to a bus stop, and when he's there, he ends up seeing this kind of squirrely looking guy coming out of the bus, and he ends up being shot by this guy. And this essentially sets up this whole, like I said, it's a subplot where Dinsmore, the Royal Dinsmore, the guy that Myra is running against, he has he has ties to the Yakuza, and so he's employed them to bring over a bunch of voting machines that already have votes built into them for him, to essentially ensure that he's going to win the election, so that, obviously when the polls open, there's already votes in, and so, he starts off with the advantage. And so Vic ends up figuring all of this out, and he contacts a judge who, unfortunately, the judge actually works for Dinsmore, is in Dinsmore's pocket, and so he lets Dinsmore know. And so then Dinsmore ends up sending these criminals to Vic's house. They attack Vic, but Vic becomes the question and essentially beats them all up. And so this puts Dinsmore in a bad situation, because now, part one of his cheating scheme has been thwarted, right? And so he And so he has to go to plan B, which is essentially how the first issue ends. He calls these criminals from out of town. This guy with this fantastic mustache here. He has this gang called the Huns, and the Huns, he essentially, Dinsmore calls them into town so that they can wreak havoc on the town, put fear into people so that they don't go out to vote. And he also has this plan where he pretty much like goes into the homeless communities and he's like giving out free, wine and beer and stuff like that, as long as they go in and vote for him. And then he gives them all baseball hats. And essentially what happens is the gang that he's called in, the Huns, they attack anybody that goes to the polls that doesn't have a baseball hat, right? And so that puts our friend Tot into a bad situation, because Tot actually goes to vote for, he actually doesn't say who he's going to vote for. We assume that it would be Myra. Todd goes in to vote and he's not wearing a baseball hat, and so the Huns actually come in and they beat him up and they put him in the hospital. And so Vic, in the meantime, he's trying to like expose everything that Dinsmore is doing. He's trying to figure out how to make it so that Dinsmore doesn't win by fraud, and so he's not around Tot, and so he ends up getting called by the hospital, and so he goes to visit Tot, and he has this conversation with Tot while Tot is unconscious, and he's essentially questioning whether or not he should intervene as the question or if he should intervene as Vic Sage, because as Vic Sage, he can report on the things that Dinsmore is doing, but he can't do that without any evidence, right? And he doesn't want to report things falsely, which, by the way, is kind of contradictory to things that he has done in the past. But I appreciate that, he would take this path on this occasion, that he doesn't want to report things falsely. And what I'm referring to, by the way, is issues in the past where he knows that, two bad parties are linked to each other, and like he'll flash a video of the one bad party when he's actually referring to the other bad party on the news screen. And ultimately, to me, that's him doing the opposite of what he's saying now, which is that he doesn't want to expose Dinsmore without evidence, that Dinsmore is doing what he's doing, and obviously Vic has some kind of evidence, but it's evidence that he's acquired as the question, and so that doesn't really count as evidence, like as evidence that he can present to the public. So he's warring in himself whether or not he should act as Vic Sage and counteract what Dinsmore is doing with the truth, or if he should go out as the question and essentially assault the Huns and attack them and essentially meet their savagery with savagery. And he starts questioning to himself whether or not a system that has to be defended with savagery is worth saving to begin with, because of the fact that, that savagery then just perpetuates itself, right? And he asks kind of the age-old moral question, do two wrongs make a right? Now, I kind of wanted to talk about that idea because there's a couple of things implicit there, right? Which is, number one, that the system is so corrupt that it has to be defended with savagery. But in this situation, what Dinsmore is doing is wrong, and so he's actually operating outside the system. If the system actually found out what Dinsmore is doing, he would be prosecuted. Now, of course, you could argue that in Hub City, the system is so corrupt because he has, judges in his pocket and things like that, and so ultimately he wouldn't pay for what he did. And so in that sense, the system can be corrupt, but that doesn't mean that the underlying foundation of the system is corrupt. It just means that essentially what's been built atop the foundation is corrupt. But the foundation itself is not corrupt, ultimately, because what Dinsmore is doing is counter to the foundation of the system. And so that's something to keep in mind, that just because a system is operating in a fashion that is corrupt doesn't mean that the foundation is actually corrupt, right? And so, this can apply to things like religion, right? Like, so, there's a famous scandal, right, in the Catholic Church that the priests are being kept from prosecution, even though they're abusing children, right? And it's obviously a terrible scandal, right? Now, does that undermine the very foundation of the structure of the church? If the church's goal is to, love your neighbor as yourself, if the church's goal is to do charity and good works in the world, if that's the foundation, the fact that priests are being protected from prosecution is actually going against the foundation. And so the problem is not the foundation. The problem is that the people who are in control are going against the foundation. And so the system itself is not what's broken. What's broken is the people that are running the system, right? And so to me, that's something to keep in mind, that because I think that human nature sometimes is our inclination is to tear down things when we see them not working the way that they're intended to work. And then, and our inclination is to just tear the whole thing down. But in reality, you don't need to tear the whole thing down. You need to reform the thing, because the thing might have good principles at the bottom. It's just that the principles are not being followed, and so you don't want to throw out all the principles, because the principles are actually good. You want to get back to the original principles. There's this kind of like Jungian idea, right, that you have to go down into the depths and rescue your father from the belly of the beast, and your father represents all the traditions of the past, all the principles and rules of the past, because ultimately, over time, right, like the law of entropy applies, that over time, people forget about the original principles, and the tendency of human beings is to like move away from good foundational principles, right? If you've ever read the Bible, throughout the Bible, there's this ongoing, in the Old Testament specifically, there's this ongoing structural or narrative reoccurrence, where essentially like the Israelites will be obeying God, right? Which even if you don't believe in God, the way that you have to think about God from a biblical perspective is he is essentially the abstraction of all things that are good and right and pure and just, and that's what the concept of holy is, right? It's a thing that's separate from the common. And so God is this abstraction of everything that's good, right? And so in the Bible, there's this idea, or there's this occurrence that happens over and over and over again, where like you'll have a generation that's committed to God, right? And so again, think about God. If you don't believe in God, that's fine. Just think about God as an abstraction of all things that are good, right? And so you have like a generation that they obey God, so they're doing the things that are good, they're doing the things that are noble, they're doing the things that are just, they're being humble, they're executing justice in a fair manner, they're not committing crimes, all of that good stuff, whatever conception of good you have, right? They're treating their neighbor as they want to be treated, right? So that's how this generation is operating. And then the next generation will come along, and they'll have like vestiges of what their fathers believed, their parents believed, but they've drifted away a little bit. And then you'll have the next generation, and then the separation between that first generation and this like new generation is so stark that essentially this new generation completely forgets all the things that God, like, think about, again, even if you don't believe in God, you think about it this way, that like while this generation was doing good, all of these good things were happening, right? Because the society was operating in a functional and good manner, right? And so all of these miracles that are coming from God, right? And you can think about them as miracles, but essentially they're the products of a good and productive society, right? Or a good and healthy society. These miracles are occurring, but then as time goes on and generations pass, they forget the miracles that happened in the times of their fathers, and And now, because of the fact that they don't see these miracles anymore, or they're taking the miracles for granted, you could argue it that way too, right? Now they've forgotten about the ways of their fathers, and so they become corrupt, they become lazy, and so they start following the ways of the rest of the nations around them, and then of course they descend into chaos, and then essentially the way that it happens in the Bible always is a prophet will intervene and call them out on this, and either the nation will respond and actually do what the prophet says, or they won't respond, and then inevitably destruction comes, right? And that's actually something that's really played upon in this story too, because in the background, something else that's going on is that there is a hurricane, or it's not a hurricane, it's a tornado that's coming. And you can view that actually as a judgment on the city, right? That's a common motif in mythological stories, right? Is that when a nation is getting corrupt, or when a community is getting corrupt, nature itself seems to pass a judgment on this community, and so you can see that in that's kind of the theme of the Noah story, right? Noah and the ark, and Noah's Ark is this idea that all of humanity has become so corrupt. And so again, within the Bible, the idea is that God is raining a flood on the earth, but you could think of it too as nature raining a flood on the earth, because of the fact that humanity has become so corrupt and it's destroying the earth. And so the earth itself reacts against what humanity is doing and sends a flood to wipe out humanity. And so in this story, there's a tornado that's coming on election day, and so that's kind of whirring around in the background, because nature, or God, is about to pass judgment on the city that has become so corrupt, and we'll get to all the tie-ins to that in a second here. But let's get back to Vic and his question, right? So, do two wrongs make a right? My question is what Vic is doing wrong? So he's questioning whether or not the question should go out and beat up these criminals. Is it wrong for him to beat up criminals who are obviously violating the process that has been instilled as at the foundation of the city? And so, sure, again, the city itself is corrupt, but the principles behind the city are not corrupt, right? Democracy, the idea of electing a representative that actually cares about you and that actually wants to fight on your behalf, and actually wants to help the community that they're a leader over. That idea is in my estimation, a perfectly valid idea, right? There's nothing wrong with that idea. The problem is that human beings have corrupted the idea, and these criminals are actually violating the principles, that the society is built upon, in order to uplift this tyrannical guy who isn't willing to win fairly, or who isn't willing to lose fairly, is essentially the situation, right? And so Vic is questioning this. Eventually, he comes to the decision that he's going to go out as the question and beat up these guys, because ultimately they're beating up a bunch of citizens. And so, what he's doing is the right thing to do. And so he attacks them, and after he beats them up, he calls in essentially his boss. I forgot what the title is, what his boss's title is. But he calls in his boss and tells his boss to tell people that the gang that's been attacking the voters, they're no longer operating, and so people can go out to vote. But he ends up telling a lie, which is something that, again, Vic Sage was wrestling with, whether or not to do something wrong in order to make something right. So he tells a lie. He doesn't tell them that it was because he beat them up. He says it's because they got a batch of bad drugs from he doesn't say it's from Dinsmore, but word gets to the head of the gang, the gentleman with the beautiful mustache. Let's find this guy again, just because this guy's mustache is the best. Well, here he is, but you don't really get to see his mustache that well there. Uh, Word gets back to him that the drugs that his gang has been taking bad drugs, and he was getting the drugs from Royal Dinsmore, and so now he's pissed off at Royal Dinsmore for selling him bad drugs, and so they actually go and kidnap Royal Dinsmore and are preparing to kill him. Right now, before we get to that, I just wanted to hone in on this one character, man, because I have to give this guy credit. This weatherman right here. This guy takes his job super serious. This guy's dedicated to his craft. You gotta give the guy credit. We'll come back to him, but he's very, very concerned about the tornado that's coming, and so he's reporting on this tornado. Like I said, this tornado is bearing down on Hub City, and Royal Dinsmore has been captured at this point by his own gang. And Vic Sage is questioning whether or not he should actually intervene, because Royal Dinsmore is obviously a jerk. He's corrupt. Why, save this guy if he's corrupt? Well, it's because Vic Sage is a noble character. And so ultimately Vic Sage comes to rescue Royal Dinsmore from the gang that Royal Dinsmore unleashed on the city. And again, this is essentially like a noble act. In all ancient cultures, essentially, in all noble ancient cultures, they typically, if you went to war with somebody and that somebody surrendered, you would actually invite them in and you'd take them as a political prisoner, right? Obviously they're still your prisoner, but you would actually treat them well because of the fact that you respect the fact that they're, that they're on another army, and that both of you guys are there, for the same reason, which is to fight on behalf of your kingdom or your nation state or whatever the case is. And so that was considered a noble act. Well, in this case, Vic is, he's treating nobly a person who really doesn't deserve it, because this guy hasn't been fighting fair. He's not there, in a sense, treating the fight as equal. But because Vic is a heroic figure, he comes to try and save Royal Dinsmore. Unfortunately, the gang is too big, and they actually hit Vic in the back. They knock him down, and they're about to actually set fire to both Dinsmore and the Question, when all of a sudden the wrath of God is poured upon the city, and the tornado strikes. And Vic and Dinsmore are saved by this tornado, because the gang is whipped up by the tornado and carried off, except for the leader of the gang, who gets buried under a piece of debris from the tornado. And Vic is again put in the situation of whether or not he should save his enemy. And again, this is what makes a person noble, right? Is that the enemy is very obviously evil, but Vic is willing to save him. And so he picks up the debris and kind of leads the guy to safety. And unfortunately for Vic, the guy, after pretending to be on Vic's side, like letting Vic lead him for a little while, ends up turning on Vic and trying to attack him from behind. And Vic tells that very classic story. I've always heard it as a frog and a scorpion, but in the way that Vic tells it, there's a beaver and a scorpion that flows across, and they're standing in front of a river, and the beaver is preparing to go across, and the scorpion says, "Hey man, let me get on your back and you can take me across too." And the beaver says, "No, you're a scorpion. When we're flowing across the river, you're gonna sting me." And the scorpion says, "Why would I sting you? If I sting you, then both of us are gonna sink into the river." And the beaver's like, "Well, okay, that makes sense." And so they start and so he lets the scorpion on his back. The beaver starts swimming across, and when they're midstream, the scorpion strikes and stings the beaver. And as both of them are going down, the beaver asks the scorpion, "You told me that if you strike me, both of us are gonna drown. Why did you sting me? And the scorpion says, it's my nature. And so, unfortunately for Vic, he decided to do the noble deed, and he paid for it. Ultimately, he still is able to wrestle his way out from the situation with the guy, and he ends up winning the fight. And Vic ends up asking this question too about the scorpion. He says to himself, "I always wondered why the beaver, in the midst of drowning, would care to ask the scorpion that question." And see, personally, I actually have an answer for that, and it's because if you're about to die, you want to know why. You want to analyze the situation and wonder to yourself, do I have any blame in this situation? And of course, the answer for the beaver is yes, because you trusted the scorpion. Now that's something to consider when you're doing a noble act, right? Is, are you going to pay for this noble act? And traditionally, the idea has been, even though you're going to pay for it, the noble thing to do is still the noble thing to do. And in fact, it's more noble if you know that you're going to suffer for the fact that you're doing good. And I also think that that's something that I think that cultures that lose, it ties back to that earlier concept I was talking about in the Bible, right? Where as the generations reproduce and continue on, they start to take for granted the miracles that went on before, right? That gifted them the society that they have now. And because of the fact that you start taking for granted the miracles that society has passed on to you, you start to again expect these miracles are commonplace to you in that situation, right? And so essentially you get soft and you start expecting bigger miracles. That's also part of the problem, right? Is you start to expect, well, if society is this good, that's just normal life, this like beautiful and good society. And so what you start craving is bigger and bigger miracles, where it's like, well, if there is a God, if when we do good things are supposed to happen, then what that means is that I should essentially be able to kind of like do nothing and think good things should still reign upon me, right? Because of the fact that I grew up doing not nothing, but like you grew up in comfort, and all of a sudden and good things just happened, right? And of course, you're not recognizing the fact that good things are happening because of the fact that these miracles happened in the past. And so you start expecting bigger and bigger miracles. And it actually makes you complacent, lazy, and ultimately kind of corrupt. And so you expect good things to happen to you for just sitting around and doing nothing. And you start to forget the fact that nobility, and the reason that I bring that back up is because I do think that our culture has fallen into that sort of malaise, right? Like we take for granted the things that like the World War II generation did for us. We take for granted some of the things even that the 1960s and 70s generation did for us. And, it's not to say that those generations are perfect or did everything right. But at the same time, it also doesn't mean that we should take for granted the things that they did do right and that they have passed on to us and gifted us with, right? And then fall into the trap of thinking that good things should happen to us even if we're not willing to do the thing that is hard and sacrificial. And so I think that that's something to consider regarding that story of the scorpion and the beaver, right? Is that it is what the beaver, now, in the beaver's situation, yeah, he trusted somebody corrupt and it bit him. But in the case of Vic, Vic is doing noble things, and the fact that there's a person willing to do noble things is actually essentially like a cornerstone to the production of a good society, which is also what Myra is, right? So Myra and Vic, both of them are like little squares or like little bricks. And if you get enough of those bricks, you start building up a good society, right? Um, Obviously, you need a good foundation, and that's kind of what I've been discussing in the throughout the video, right? Is the idea that the foundation might be good, but then the bricks on top are bad. Yeah, then you need to tear down that part, but that doesn't mean that you have to tear down the foundation. And so Vic and Myra are actually bricks that are living up to the foundation, to the foundational principles that Hub City is built upon, right? All right, so the tornado comes. It pretty much demolishes all of Hub City. And so God's wrath has been poured upon the city. It has been cleansed. And there's this moment. Oh, before we get to that moment, I got to highlight my friend the weatherman. So this is why I say that this guy is so committed to his cause. So the power goes out in the news station, and so he can't report on the weather anymore. And so because he is the weatherman, he has to go out into the tornado and yell to the world that the tornado is coming. And then he gets sucked up and electrocuted by power lines. Poor guy, man. That is, honestly, it's one of my favorite things about Denny O'Neil. Those kind of like side characters that in a sense, like, have like a karmic sort of fate is really the best way I can think to describe it. But essentially, yeah, that this guy, he believes so much in his role as the weatherman that he's willing to sacrifice his own life to bring the weather to the people. And so that's somebody that has, embodied their archetype, that recognizes their place in the grand scheme of things, and is willing to die, even if, to be the weatherman. And so may all of us be willing to die for whatever it is that we're born to do, right? Because if you're not willing to die for it, are you born to do it, right? Isn't that what the thing that defines your life? Anyways, so the storm comes, it destroys things. Vic wakes up after, almost being thrown across the city. And I'm going to actually read exactly what he says, because I want to talk about this a little bit. He says, "The day was beautiful, the most beautiful I'd ever seen. It was as if all the grime had been wiped from the sky, and the sunlight was clean and strong, and the breeze from the river was gentle and playful. I laughed aloud, laughed like a child, and felt as though I were standing in the first dawn of creation." And so, like I said, there's something there that I want to talk about, right? Which is that when the judgment of God is rained upon the earth, right? Because there's this city that's so corrupt, right? So again, the foundation is good, but then the house or the building built atop it has been corrupted, right? And so what happens is the wrath of God comes, the wrath of nature, whatever you want to call it, the wrath of karma comes. It breaks down the building, it leaves the foundation, and now the foundation is clean to be built upon again. And again, that's if you read through the Bible, that's a very biblical idea, the idea that when God's judgment comes, it cleanses so that now a new creation can be built atop this old creation. That's essentially the story of the book of Revelation, right? Is that there's all this wickedness through the earth because there's this corrupt system that has oppressed all of the people. And so in Revelation, Jesus comes riding down on a white horse, and he burns the earth, right? And then he recreates the earth. He creates a new earth. And so this is the idea here, that Hub City has been this corrupt place. And so God comes and he destroys it, and now it's ready to be rebuilt. God or nature or karma, again, I don't want to impose a belief system. It's just the idea, right? It's a mythological idea that, again, there's some kind of force outside of us that reacts to our deeds. And so that force comes in and renews Hub City so that now it can be built new. Now, two things are going to happen here. One is that we're going to find out that Royal Dinsmore was elected mayor. and he won by 1 vote. Vic didn't get to vote. So now Myra has lost the election because of Vic. And I do think that one of the messages that Denny's trying to convey there is that you could be that 1 vote that decides whether or not a tyrant or a noble person is elected into office. And that is true. As I've said, I'm apolitical. I don't vote. And so I do want to point out that I do think that that's a message that Denny's trying to convey there. And I won't contradict or argue on my behalf. I'll acknowledge Denny's point there, which is that is true. You can be the deciding vote between an evil person and a noble person being elected. That's true. Whether or not there is a noble option is something else to consider. But anyways, let's move on from that. So we find out that Royal Dinsmore was elected, but he was killed by the tornado. He had escaped from the gang, and he was driving away in his car, and the car was picked up by the tornado, tossed into the river, and ultimately he drowned. And so you have a very, karmic or biblical sort of lesson there, right? Which is, again, see, nature is coming in and it's wiping things clean. And so even if Hub City in its past corruption elected this tyrant, nature was not going to allow for that. God was not going to allow for that. Karma was not going to allow for that. It wiped the corruption clean. And now it has allowed for Myra, who was in second place, who got the second most votes in the election, to now become the mayor. And that's going to bring us to our conclusion. All throughout the issue, Mayor Furman has been having debates with Myra. He actually tells her that he thinks that she's going to win, and he tells her that she's going to make history. And she doesn't actually understand what he means by that, because she's like, oh, there's been plenty of female mayors in the past. Even if I do win, I don't think that that's really a historic moment. And he ends up telling her, it's not because of that I say that. And he actually ends up insulting her at one point, because she starts getting down on herself and thinking that she's going to lose the election. And he starts criticizing her and telling her, oh, yeah, you liberal commies, you're all the same. You're all defeatists. You always think that you're going to lose. You're so pathetic and emotional. And she actually snaps at him and tells him, look, I'm at kind of my breaking point in terms of caring about you, because even though I think that you're sick and that you have a disease, which is alcoholism, it's starting to wear on me. And, I've been propping you up essentially for a whole year as your wife. I'm in this sham marriage that I was conned into, and I'm basically at the wit's end of my patience, and you need to shut up and stop talking, because you're driving me crazy. And Mayor Furman takes this rather personally, which is going to lead here to the conclusion. So Myra goes up to accept her new role as the mayor, and she's at a press conference, and she's kind of dictating her new direction that she's going to take the city in. And Mayor Furman pulls out that gun that he's been threatening to kill himself with throughout the story. He aims it at Myra, and he shoots her. And that's how the issue ends. And so poor Myra, for doing the right thing, just like Vic earlier in the issue, when he does the right thing, he pays for it. Myra does the right thing, and she pays for it. And ultimately that's something to think about. If you want to be good, are you willing to pay with your life for that good thing? Just like the weatherman. Because ultimately that is what being good is about, is how much are you willing to sacrifice of yourself for that cause that you believe in. Not sacrifice others, but sacrifice yourself. Because if your cause sacrifices others rather than yourself, how noble is that cause? Isn't that kind of the definition of selfishness, that you believe in a cause that benefits you at the expense of everybody else? All right, guys. I love you all. Thank you for listening. I hope to see you next time. Have a good day.